Hello, this is a video about the software and workflow that I use to process my photos. It follows on from a video I made in May this year, which was about the software and workflow for the images of invertebrates that I captured with my FZ330 bridge camera. That was rather a long video. This one's going to be shorter, I hope. It's about my workflow. It may or may not be of any use to anyone else, but if it isn't in total, there may be some parts of it which are useful. And it's what I use currently, but that does change. It's changed since May, for example. It's all about single shot images. There's nothing here about multi-shot images like panoramas or exposure brackets or focus bracketing. And I almost always use RAW, and this process is oriented around RAW images, although you could use a similar approach for JPEG. Unlike in May, this process I use with all my cameras, and I use it to produce images that are 1300 pixels high, produced for viewing on screen at 1300 pixels high, and preferably on a calibrated screen in subdued lighting if you really want to see it how I intended it to be seen. The workflow has to deal sometimes, or quite often, with large numbers of images, and I'm talking up to 1,000 a day. That's not 1,000 every day, but 1,000 on some days, occasionally. More often in the 300 to 600 range. Because of the way I work and because of a lot of what I do is close-up and macro, I have a very high failure rate. And also, if an image does work, because I repeatedly take pictures of the same subject over and over again, trying to get a nice one, if it does work, I may have a lot of very similar versions of the same subject. The workflow has a number of stages which we'll look at. It uses 5 separate pieces of software, and it's inevitably going to look complicated and long-winded, but in practice it turns out to be a pretty fast way of dealing with these big data sets. So I use this workflow now because I've adjusted it since May, and I now use it for a small sensor bridge camera, a travel camera, which is also a small sensor, several micro four thirds cameras, and an APS-C DSLR. Those cameras in particular shown there. I use these with various add-ons, various lenses for the interchangeable lens cameras and various add-on lenses for all of them, close-up lenses. And I use these cameras for close-ups and macros mainly, occasionally birds in flight, gulls mainly at the local marina, skyscapes, sunsets, haven't done any of those for a long time though, ships passing up and down the Severn Estuary, which is just a couple hundred yards away from where we live, and occasionally some other things as well. So the stages in the workflow are to load the images onto the computer and back them up, do a very rapid first cut selection, batch process the images that are in that first cut, and after that do image specific processing, whilst at the same time picking out the ones that I want to keep. At that stage, I'm not making a final decision. I'm really picking out ones that I think could come out acceptably. I then generate these 1300 pixel high JPEGs, and I have a closer look at them, and I reject more of them. Sometimes it's a case of, well, I think that one might be okay, but it needs to be processed differently. I then decide what order to put them in, just in case anyone's going to look through them in order, so there's some sort of logic to either visually or in terms of the content as to the order they come in. And at the same time as I'm doing that, I'm making what's now a final selection as to which ones are going to be in and which ones are going to be out. So I then end up with my 1300 pixel high keepers. And then there's administrative work to be done, making backups, uploading to Flickr, uploading a backup to another online drive that I use, where I keep the RAWs as well as the JPEGs, because you can't put the RAWs up at Flickr. So that's the process which we're now going to look through. So it starts with loading and backup. Well, that's just a case of using, as before, using Faststone Image Viewer to load the images off a card, and I then back them up and make a backup copy of them onto a separate drive. And then do the first cut selection. Now, previously I used Faststone Image Viewer for this, but now I use Fast Picture Viewer. The reason I use Fast Picture Viewer now is that, like Faststone, it lets me go through very fast, and if you look at the top left you'll see a 1 turning up every now and then. I'm not actually choosing relevant ones, but it's just I have one finger on the 1 key and fingers on the arrow keys, so I just keep going through very fast, as I described in the previous video. The reason for doing this is that, having picked the ones that might be okay, and in this case I think I ended up with perhaps 300 out of 800 or so. It's a very quick initial sift. Having done that, Fast Picture Viewer then lets me run a batch file which I've developed in Fast Picture Viewer, which puts the picks out the images based on their ISO, and it picks the ones first of all that have got this 1 in it, and then for those it puts them into different folders depending on what their ISO is. Now the reason for doing that is that previously I used the same processing parameters in DxO Optics Pro, which was the first stage and is the first stage of the batch processing. Now I've decided it's better to use separate parameters in relation to the noise reduction in DxO Optics Pro, depending on what the ISO is, and this makes it easy to do because I can go to each of these folders and simply select all of the images. There are 58 in this one, and Control A, oh there it goes, selects them all, and having done that, in one move I can apply a preset to them, and here I've got presets which are ISO specific, so in this case I can apply the ISO 400 one to them, and then I can tell DxO to produce the DNG files, which I pass on to SilkyPix, and it puts the DNG files in the same folder as the RAW files are in. When it's finished doing all of these, I then go through each of these folders and simply move the DNG files into this new folder here that I've made, DxO DNG, which is now empty, but I move them into there so that SilkyPix sees all the DNG files in one place, which makes them again easier to handle. In terms of what DxO is doing, it's applying a bit of its smart lighting and a bit of its clear view. It's enhancing the micro contrast a bit. These are all fairly modest settings. It's dealing with vignetting, and it is doing prime noise reduction. This is the one of the main reasons for using DxO Optics Pro, is that it has very good noise reduction. It uses its lens softness thing, which takes into account the characteristics of the lens being used, and basically sharpens it up and makes more detail visible, deals with chromatic aberration, and doesn't deal with distortion. This is one of the things that DxO is meant to be very good at, but in fact I've turned it off. So DxO goes away and takes some time to process them, and the next stage is to go into SilkyPix, and at that point I've copied the DNG files from these folders into this one folder here, and in SilkyPix I can simply select them all and apply a set of parameters to them. Again, I use the same parameters for all of them in this case, so I just select that and tell it to apply the parameters to all of them, and now I can tell SilkyPix to produce, to develop these, as it calls it, and it produces TIFF files. What SilkyPix is doing is dealing with the highlights. It's very good at retaining colour in highlights, and the other thing it's doing is some sharpening, because I find that it can help produce a lot more visible detail if I use the sharpening of SilkyPix. Now, one of the things I've changed since last time is the amount of this sharpening that I use in SilkyPix. Previously in May I was doing all the sharpening here in SilkyPix, and that was resulting in some noise-like characteristics in plain backgrounds. So I've turned down the sharpening here and have started using sharpening additionally in Lightroom. So SilkyPix produces TIFF files for all of these, and these go into a subdirectory which I call SP developed. At that point, when that's done, I can pick them up in Lightroom, which looks at the SP developed subdirectory, and here I can start doing image specific adjustments. But before I do that, again, I select them all and I apply a saved preset, which is a user preset here, and there we go, that's applied it. Now if we look at, if I unselect that, we'll look at an individual image, and it's got some quite small adjustments made to it. The temperature is adjusted very slightly, the clarity is up a very little bit, the vibrance is down a very little bit, and there's some sharpening turned on here to complement or add to the sharpening that's done in SilkyPix. And what's important in this context is that there is masking, that now we can see this is what's actually going to be sharpened, the bits that you can see in white, and I apply this mask to all of the images and this sharpening. What that means is that SilkyPix has done some sharpening to begin with, but not so much that the background has gone crunchy. I then apply more sharpening in Lightroom, but the masking means that the background, which was what was giving me the trouble before, doesn't get any sharpening. And I'm finding this is giving me a strong but controlled sharpening that I like the look of. So this is how I start out in Lightroom, and then I do the usual sorts of things of more adjustments on highlights and shadows and whatever. so that, for example, if I've got 4 images here which look fairly similar in terms of their brightness, so I might turn the exposure down a bit and adjust perhaps the whites and the blacks, not that much, and I can then copy those settings across. If I synchronize those, they've all now got the same settings, and I crop and well, anything else that I'm inclined to do in Lightroom to the individual images. Now at this stage I'm back to doing selection, so when I've got these 5, for example, I'll end up using perhaps one of them, perhaps 2. I mean, that's one's a bit bigger than the others, so if that bigger one was okay, I might use one of the small ones and one of the big ones, or I might use none of them if none of them look any good. And I sometimes have really quite a lot of similar images of a particular subject. So there's selection going on here. So when that's done, so we've done the first cut selection and the batch processing. We do the image specific processing with the associated selection, and at that point Lightroom generates these 1300 pixel high JPEGs. Now at that point, where I have a closer look at them, Lightroom, I put them into another directory, at which point I go back to Faststone. Now previously I was using XNView, at least for the final check on these, because it managed the color better than Faststone. Now I don't know whether I've changed the way my computer works or whether they've changed Faststone, but it seems to be handling the color okay now. So I've dropped XNView and I just do all this in Faststone, because one of the nice things about Faststone is that I can move stuff around easily. So I'll move that one up here, for example, which can be very useful when I'm trying to sort of bunch things together or put them in order of size, and then I'll go through, and if I've got 15 of increasing size, I'll choose maybe the first, the fourth, the 10th or whatever. So I've got just a reasonably small-ish number, although I still end up with quite big numbers of some of these, where I've got a sequence like this that I just like having plenty of them. This is where I arrange them in the order that they could be viewed sensibly in that order. Now a lot of them, for a sequence for example, the order doesn't get changed because this is the order that things actually happened in when I saw them, although I do sometimes take liberties with that. Other times I may have the same subject that I've come back to after a while and had another go at, so I may consolidate the images that I've got of a particular subject. And that is pretty much it. We're back to the administrative work, the making the backup copies and all the rest. So that's what the process looks like now, and because I've changed the way the sharpening is done, I'm finding that I can use the same process most of the time for all sorts of images, and that's simplified things quite nicely. So that's my current process. I hope there's something of use in that somewhere. And that's all for now. Goodbye.